In the long, slow summers of the deep South, when the days stretched endlessly beneath a merciless sun, and the nights brought little relief from the oppressive heat, when the air hung thick and still, and even the crickets seemed to drowse in the shade. In those languorous, dreamlike days of childhood, time moved differently. A summer could contain an entire lifetime of experience, and the events of a single year could shape the course of all the years to come. This is a story about such a summer, about such a year, in a small Alabama town called Maycomb, during the depths of the Great Depression, when poverty settled over the South like a shroud, and hope seemed as scarce as money. It is a story told through the eyes of a child named Jean-Louise Finch, called Scout by everyone who knew her, looking back across the years at the events that transformed her understanding of the world and the people in it. Maycomb was a tired old town, even in those days. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew on the sidewalks, and the courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow, it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning, and ladies bathed before noon after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slowly then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in and out of the stores around it, took their time about everything. A day was 24 hours long, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with, nothing to see outside the boundaries of Maycomb County. But it was a time and a place that would stay with Scout Finch forever, carved into her memory with the clarity of events witnessed in the absolute certainty of childhood before the world grew complex and the clear lines between right and wrong began to blur. Scout lived with her older brother Jim and their father Atticus Finch on the main residential street of Maycomb. Their mother had died when Scout was 2, a loss she barely remembered, but which shaped their household in subtle ways. Their father was a lawyer, a man of quiet dignity and unwavering principle, who raised his children with a gentle firmness that allowed them considerable freedom while instilling in them a strong moral compass. Atticus was a man unlike other fathers in Maycomb. He was older, nearly 50, when Scout was growing up, and he did not hunt or fish or play poker with the other men of the town. He worked in an office, he wore glasses, and he read constantly, often late into the night. Some of the children at school thought Scout and Jim unfortunate to have such an old, bookish father, but they would come to understand that Atticus Finch possessed a courage far greater than any displayed in hunting expeditions or sporting contests. The Finch household also included Calpurnia, their cook and housekeeper, a stern, imposing black woman who had been with the family since Jim was born. Calpurnia ruled the kitchen with an iron hand and had taken on much of the responsibility for raising the Finch children. She was stricter than Atticus, quicker to discipline, but her love for Scout and Jim was evident in every meal she prepared, every scraped knee she tended, every lesson in manners she administered with varying degrees of patience. The summer Scout was nearly 6 years old. A boy named Dill came to stay with his aunt, Miss Rachel Haverford, who lived next door. Dill was a curious little thing, small for his age, with white blonde hair and a vivid imagination that more than compensated for his physical stature. He'd come from Meridian, Mississippi, and he was full of fantastic stories about his adventures. Though Scout and Jem suspected many of these stories were enhanced by Dill's considerable creative abilities, it was Dill who became fascinated with the Radley place, that mysterious house at the end of their street where Arthur Boo Radley lived in seclusion. The Radley house was a source of endless speculation and fear among the children of Maycomb. Boo Radley never came out, hadn't been seen in years, and rumors surrounded him like a dark fog. He dined on raw squirrels and cats. His teeth were yellow and rotten, his eyes popped, and he drooled most of the time. The truth, as Atticus would have told them had they asked, was likely far less dramatic. Arthur Radley had gotten into trouble as a youth, some minor scrape with the law, and his father, a harsh religious man, had kept him locked inside the house rather than let him be sent to reform school. Years had passed, the old man had died, and Boo's brother Nathan had returned to take care of him, maintaining the family's isolation from the community. But to the children of Maycomb, Boo Radley was a ghost, a monster, a source of delicious terror on hot summer nights when they dared each other to run up and touch the Radley house before fleeing back to safety. That summer passed in a haze of games and adventures, of lazy afternoons reading on the porch, and evenings catching fireflies in mason jars. Scout was a tomboy through and through, much to the dismay of her Aunt Alexandra and the other proper ladies of Maycomb, who felt she should be learning to wear dresses and act like a lady. But Atticus never forced such transformations on his daughter. He let her wear overalls, climb trees, and fight with boys who insulted her, though he did try to curb her tendency to settle disputes with her fists. As autumn arrived and school began, Scout found herself struggling with the rigid expectations of formal education. She could already read, Atticus had taught her, and she quickly grew bored with the pedestrian pace of her first-grade class. Her teacher, Miss Caroline Fisher, was young and fresh from college, full of new educational theories, but utterly unprepared for the realities of teaching in a small southern town where poverty was endemic and many children came to school hungry. It was during these early school days that Scout began to understand the complex social hierarchies of Maycomb. There were the old families like the Finches, whose genteel poverty was considered respectable. There were the Cunninghams, poor farmers who paid their debts in goods rather than money, but who maintained their dignity and independence. And then there were families like the Ewells, who lived behind the town dump, whose children came to school on the first day and never returned, who were, in the dismissive phrase of Maycomb society, trash. Atticus taught Scout an important lesson during this time, one that would echo through all the events to come. You never really understand a person, he told her, until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. It was a lesson in empathy, in the necessity of seeing the world through others' eyes, and Scout would have many occasions to remember these words in the months ahead. Winter came, and with it an event so rare in Maycomb that it seemed almost miraculous. Snow, real snow, falling from the sky in great white flakes, covering the town in a blanket of white that transformed the familiar landscape into something strange and magical. Scout had never seen snow before, and she and Jem spent the day building a snowman, or rather, a snow and mud man, as there wasn't quite enough snow for a proper snowman. That same night, Miss Maudie's house caught fire. The entire neighborhood turned out to watch as the flames consumed the old house, and in the chaos and cold, someone, Boo Radley, they realized later, had slipped a blanket around Scout's shoulders without her even noticing. It was their first real evidence that Boo Radley was not the monster of their imaginations, but rather a lonely, perhaps damaged man who nonetheless cared about the children who lived on his street. But these were merely the prelude to events that would shake Maycomb to its foundations and force Scout and Jem to confront the darkest aspects of human nature. In February, Atticus received an appointment that would change their lives. He was assigned to defend Tom Robinson, a black man accused of raping a white woman named Mayella Ewell. In the South of the 1930s, in towns like Maycomb, where the old ways held firm and the lines between black and white were drawn with rigid certainty, such an accusation was tantamount to a death sentence. No one expected Atticus to actually defend Tom Robinson. The expectation was that he would go through the motions, put on a show for the sake of legal propriety, and then let the inevitable conviction proceed. But Atticus Finch was not a man to do things by halves, and he believed with absolute conviction that Tom Robinson was innocent. The town turned against them. Scout found herself fighting in the schoolyard when children called her father names. Atticus forbade her to fight, asking her instead to hold her head high and keep her fists down no matter what anyone said. It was a hard lesson for a passionate, hot-tempered child, but Scout tried her best to honor her father's wishes, though her best was not always good enough. As summer approached once more, tensions in Maycomb rose. Tom Robinson was being held in the county jail, and there were rumors, dark, ugly rumors, that men might come from the countryside to take matters into their own hands, to mete out the rough justice of the mob before the trial could even begin. One night, Atticus went to the jail to sit outside Tom Robinson's cell, a solitary figure reading his newspaper in the pool of light from a single bulb. Scout, Jem, and Dill, who had returned for the summer, followed him there, worried about their father. They arrived just as a group of men appeared, farmers from Old Sarum, their faces hard and determined in the headlights of their cars. It could have ended in tragedy. The men had come to lynch Tom Robinson, and Atticus stood alone between them and their quarry. But then Scout broke free from her hiding place and ran into the circle of light, her brother following reluctantly behind. Her innocent presence there, her childish recognition of one of the men, Walter Cunningham, whose son was in her class at school, somehow broke the spell of mob violence. She spoke to Mr. Cunningham about his entailment, about his son, made him see himself as an individual rather than as part of an angry, faceless crowd. And the men, their bloodlust diffused by the clear eyes of a child, shuffled away into the darkness, leaving Tom Robinson safe for another night. The trial itself took place in the sweltering heat of July, in the old courthouse, where all of Maycomb seemed to gather. White folks on the main floor, black folks in the colored balcony. Scout, Jem, and Dill watched from the balcony with Reverend Sykes and the black community, looking down on the courtroom where their father would fight a battle he knew he could not win, but which honor demanded he fight nonetheless. The evidence was clear to anyone willing to see it. Mayella Ewell had been beaten, certainly, but her injuries, a black eye on the right side of her face, bruises on the right side of her neck, suggested her attacker had led with his left hand. Tom Robinson's left arm was crippled, withered from a childhood accident, and hung useless at his side. He could not have inflicted those injuries. Moreover, Tom Robinson's testimony had the ring of truth. He had worked for the Ewells occasionally, doing odd jobs, and Mayella had asked him into the house that day under the pretense of needing help with a chore. But once inside, she had made advances toward him, had tried to kiss him, had expressed her loneliness and desperation in a way that both repelled and terrified Tom. He had fled, knowing the danger he was in, but not before her father, Bob Ewell, had appeared and seen them together. Atticus's closing argument was a masterpiece of logic and appeal to conscience. He spoke of the presumption of innocence, of the lack of medical evidence, of the convenient fact that no doctor had been called to examine Mayella Ewell, despite the severity of her alleged injuries. He reminded the jury that in the eyes of the law, all men are created equal, and that the courtroom is the one place where that ideal should be made reality. But he was asking the jury to do something that had never been done in Macomb County, to take the word of a black man over that of white people, even white people as disreputable as the Ewells. He was asking them to rise above the prejudices of their upbringing, to see Tom Robinson not as a representative of his race, but as an individual man falsely accused, whose only crime had been to pity a white woman desperate enough to break the rigid codes of Southern society. The jury deliberated for hours, an unusually long time, Atticus noted, suggesting that at least one or two jurors had fought for acquittal. But in the end, the verdict came back as everyone had known it would. Guilty on all charges. Scout and Jem watched from the balcony as their father packed his briefcase and walked alone from the courtroom. And then something remarkable happened. The entire balcony, every black person who had witnessed Atticus Finch's courageous defense, rose to their feet in silent tribute as he passed beneath them. Reverend Sykes touched Scout's shoulder. "Miss Jean Louise, stand up. Your father's passing." It was a moment of profound respect, a recognition that even though the battle had been lost, the fighting of it had mattered, that moral courage counts for something even in defeat. But Bob Ewell was not satisfied with his victory. He had been made to look foolish on the witness stand, had been exposed as a liar and an abuser, and though he had won the case, he had lost his dignity in the process. He confronted Atticus outside the post office, spat in his face, and threatened him. "Too proud to fight, you nigger-loving bastard?" Atticus simply wiped his face and walked away, but Scout and Jem worried. Their father assured them that Bob Ewell had gotten his anger out of his system, that they had nothing to fear. He was wrong. The summer ended, Dill returned to Meridian, and life in Macomb returned to its slow, predictable rhythms. Scout began second grade, and autumn brought the annual Halloween pageant, in which Scout was to play a ham in a theatrical production about Macomb County's agricultural products, a role that required her to wear a large chicken wire costume covered in brown cloth. After the pageant, Scout and Jem walked home through the darkness, taking the road that passed by the Radley place. Scout was still wearing her ham costume, unable to see well through the eye holes, when they became aware of someone following them. At first, they thought it was their friend Cecil Jacobs playing a prank, but the footsteps were too heavy, the presence too menacing. Bob Ewell attacked them in the darkness beneath the trees, seeking revenge on Atticus by harming his children. Jem fought back, his arm broken in the struggle, and Scout, trapped inside her unwieldy costume, could only hear the sounds of violence, grunting, scuffling. Jem's cry of pain. Then another figure entered the fight, a man who moved with surprising strength, and there was a final, terrible sound, the sound of a knife finding its mark, of Bob Ewell's life ending beneath the trees he had chosen for his ambush. When the struggle ended, when Scout finally tore free from her costume and called for Jem, she found her brother lying unconscious, his arm bent at an impossible angle. And, standing in the shadows, breathing heavily, was a man she had never seen before, a pale, thin figure with colorless eyes, wearing clothes that seemed to hang on his thin frame. It was Arthur Radley, Boo Radley, the monster of their childhood imagination, who had turned out to be their savior. Boo carried Jem home in his arms. This reclusive man who had lived in shadow for so many years, emerging into the light to save the children who had feared and fantasized about him. The doctor was called, the sheriff arrived, and the adults pieced together what had happened. Bob Ewell had died in the struggle, killed by his own knife, and the children had been saved by the intervention of Maycomb's most unlikely hero. Sheriff Tate made a decision that night, a decision to protect Boo Radley from the attention and scrutiny that would follow if the truth became public. The official story would be that Bob Ewell had fallen on his own knife, an accident. It was, in its way, a kind of lie, but it was a lie told in the service of a greater justice. Atticus initially protested, worried about setting such a precedent, but Scout understood. "Well, it'd be sort of like shooting a mockingbird, wouldn't it?" she said, referring to her father's earlier teaching that mockingbirds do nothing but make music for people to enjoy, and that it's a sin to kill them. Boo Radley was like a mockingbird. He had done nothing but good, had saved their lives, and to expose him to public attention would be a kind of cruelty. That night, Scout walked Boo Radley home, taking his arm as a lady might take a gentleman's arm, leading him back to the Radley house, where he had lived in isolation for so many years. She stood on the Radley porch and looked out at the neighborhood from Boo's perspective, seeing their street as he had seen it, understanding at last what her father had meant about walking in someone else's shoes. She never saw Boo Radley again. He retreated back into his house, back into his solitary existence, but he had given her a profound gift, the understanding that people are often more than they appear, that kindness can come from unexpected sources, and that the most unlikely heroes are sometimes the ones who matter most. As Scout lay in bed that night, with Jem sleeping in the next room, his broken arm set and bandaged, Atticus sat with her and read aloud from a book, his voice soft in the lamplight. She drifted toward sleep, thinking about all that had happened, about Tom Robinson and Boo Radley, about courage and cowardice, about justice and injustice. She thought about her father's words, about how most people are nice when you finally see them, when you step outside your own perspective and try to understand their fears, their hopes, their struggles. She thought about the Mockingbirds of the world, the Tom Robinsons and Boo Radleys, people who do no harm but are harmed by a world that fails to see their humanity. The trial had been lost. Tom Robinson had died trying to escape from prison, shot 17 times, the guards claimed, though Atticus knew it was more likely an execution than an escape attempt. Justice had not prevailed in the courtroom, but something else had been accomplished. Atticus Finch had made a stand, had shown his children and his community what it means to fight for what's right, even when the outcome is certain defeat. He had modeled moral courage, and that lesson would stay with Scout and Jim for the rest of their lives. Years later, looking back on that extraordinary year, Scout would understand how profoundly those experiences had shaped her. She had learned that the world is not simple, that people are neither wholly good nor wholly evil, that justice is an ideal we strive for, but rarely achieve perfectly. She had learned about prejudice and poverty, about the arbitrary division society creates between people, about the courage required to challenge those divisions even when the battle seems hopeless. Maycomb County would change slowly over the years, as the South changed, as the old certainties crumbled and new understandings emerged. The trial of Tom Robinson would be remembered as a turning point, one of many small battles in the long struggle for justice and equality. And Atticus Finch would be remembered as a man who stood up when standing up mattered most, who taught his children by example rather than by lecture, who lived his principles even when doing so cost him dearly. But perhaps the most important lesson was the simplest one, the one that Scout learned on the Radley porch that night when she stood in Boo's shoes and saw the world through his eyes, that people are more than they seem, that judgment should be suspended until understanding is achieved, that empathy is not weakness, but strength. The summer heat eventually breaks in Maycomb, as it always does. The oppressive humidity gives way to cooler autumn air, and the town settles back into its rhythms. Children grow older, memories fade, and life continues with its mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy. But some summers remain forever vivid in memory, preserved like insects in amber, their lessons enduring long after the heat has dissipated and the players have moved on. Scout Finch would carry those lessons forward into her life, would become a woman shaped by that year of revelation and loss, of fear and courage, of childhood innocence shattered and adult understanding earned. She would remember her father's quiet dignity, her brother's protective love, Calpurnia's stern affection, and Boo Radley's silent heroism. She would remember Tom Robinson's doomed testimony and Bob Ewell's pathetic rage. She would remember the feeling of standing on that porch, seeing her street from Boo's perspective, understanding at last what her father had meant about walking in another person's shoes. And she would remember the mockingbirds, those innocent creatures who do no harm but sing their songs and bring beauty to the world, who ask nothing but to be left in peace, who are sometimes killed anyway by people who should know better. She would remember that it is indeed a sin to kill a mockingbird, and she would try, in her own way, to protect the mockingbirds she encountered in her life, to stand up for those who could not stand up for themselves, to be the kind of person her father had shown her how to be. The old courthouse still stands in the square, and the street still turned to red slop when it rains. The live oaks spread their ancient branches over the sidewalks, and the summer heat still settles over the town like a heavy blanket. But the children who played beneath those trees have grown and gone, and Maycomb itself has changed, slowly but inexorably, shaped by the small acts of courage performed by ordinary people, who chose, in their moment of testing, to do what was right rather than what was easy. This is the legacy of that summer, of that year, of those events that unfolded in a small Alabama town during the depths of the Depression. This is the story of Scout Finch and her father Atticus, of Jem and Dill and Boo Radley, of Tom Robinson and Myella Ewell, of all the people who taught a child that the world is complex and difficult, but that moral courage matters, that justice is worth fighting for, even when the fight is lost, and that understanding and empathy are the foundations upon which any decent society must be built. The mockingbirds still sing in Maycomb, their songs rising sweet and clear in the summer twilight. And somewhere, in memory, a little girl stands on a porch and sees the world through new eyes, understanding at last that most people are real nice when you finally see them, when you take the time to understand, when you remember that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about. Thus ends our tale of a summer in Maycomb, of lessons learned and innocence lost, of courage displayed and justice denied, of mockingbirds singing and children growing up to face a world both more terrible and more beautiful than they had ever imagined. The night deepens, the stars shine bright above the old town, and the stories endure, passed from generation to generation, reminding us always to be kind, to be brave, to stand up for what is right, and never, ever to kill a mockingbird.